Eh bien, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here for this conference on the CSRD, which is a tool for helping you with your CSR strategy. It's something that's important for a lot of companies at the moment, and I have the pleasure of welcoming Marianne Gobert, Director for CSR and Public Relations at CERFIM. You're part of a company, so a small company that will be celebrating its 150th anniversary soon. You have 50 subsidiaries and 10 or so professions. And of course, that's quite complex because you now have to meet the regulations. During this conference, we'll also hear from Peggy Deutsch, who's the General Manager for Conductix, in charge of environmental transition questions, and Olivier Danet, who is Project Manager for NG Solutions. You're also an elected official of the CCI in the Savoie area, and you focus on all questions relating to decarbonization. We also have Julie Dalban-Canassi, who's in charge of the eco-design certificate at the engineering school in Grenoble, and you're in charge of Into the Wild as well. You focus on standardization and CSRD questions. So this presentation will be broken down into 3 phases. I'll give a quick introduction to the fundamentals behind the directive, so that will be a summary so that you can get to know the regulation. Then we'll have some theme-based light being shed on things concretely from our 4 guests. It is quite a difficult subject. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Either we'll do it here, or maybe we can go to the VIP space just next door. You can come and ask us about any reference documents or any questions that you have. So this new regulation, the CSRD, what does it mean? It means Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So basically, it's a new regulation that's only been applied since the 1st of January of this year. It defines a fairly complex reference framework, an exacting framework, obliging companies to take on board ESG criteria, environment, social, and governance aspects in their strategies. This new regulation is a follow-on from the extra-financial reporting. So it's basically a review of previous requirements. It's part of the European Green Deal. So that's when we had an obligation to reorient capital to more virtuous companies in order to speed up transition process. So it's all very much linked, isn't it? Everything that's financial and extra-financial. And the challenge is huge. Today, there are 50,000 companies that are concerned in Europe by this regulation, and only 80%, well, over 80% of them have never reported extra-financial questions. So why is the European Union speeding things up when it comes to regulations? Why is it ramping things up? Well, what is behind this CSRD is to speed up the environmental transition processes at planetary level and help things with business and introduce connectivity between all things financial and extra-financial, and that's something that's new. When we look at reference frameworks or ISO standards or, even energy certificates, things were not necessarily connected to financial performance. And then another ambition is to make things uniform, to standardize sustainability reporting, because the landscape is highly heterogeneous with CSR reports that are not standardized. Performance reporting, extra-financial performance reporting is fairly complex when it comes to comparison. And greenwashing. The European Union wants to standardize all reports. So reports will be done on an electronic platform, and they will be obligatory and audited by independent bodies. And then there's also this idea of strengthening transparency when it comes to ESG information. So it's about being vigilant, the duty of vigilance, a law that's been applicable in France since 2007, how to make sure that you prevent any risks entering your value chain. So here's the latest calendar. Things change quite quickly, in fact, with respect to this calendar. But this is the latest one when it comes to extra-financial performance reporting. So these are the first two companies that are going to be concerned. So 2025 will be for reporting data relating to 2024 with two types of criteria. So 50 million euros in terms of turnover and 500 employees. And 2026, you will have to meet two of the three criteria. Over 250 employees, 50 million euros in turnover, or 25 million euros on the balance sheet, and then we continue through to years later on. What's interesting is that in the CSRD reference framework, there's a focus on stakeholders in the value chain and how we look at that upstream and downstream. And as part of due diligence and the CSRD, we're going to have to ask our stakeholders, our partners, to be accountable. Your customers are going to be asking you, therefore, to be accountable when it comes to ESG. So the first sustainability report will have to include the first CSRD criteria. So what about the major changes concerned when it comes to ESG? There are three standards that are concerned, 4 fields of application, double materiality. So this is a new approach for comparing the impact and performance of companies, and then the analysis of deviations. So often we already analyze deviations from one year to the next. So let's talk about the 10 ESG standards. There are cross-cutting standards that clearly define formalism or regulatory obligations. So these are theme-based standards. So this is what we find in the taxonomy. They're linked to the obligations when it comes to sustainable development and climate change, where we talk about mitigation and adaptation to climate change, but also all questions relating to energy management, pollution, water resources, how to manage the water resource, biodiversity, its preservation, and then the integration of the circular economy. Then in the framework, in order to draw up the report, you also have to take up social questions with 4 criteria. The staff numbers of the company, so that's like your HR policy. We have labor laws that are very well drawn up in France. So there are people working on the value chain. This involves defining what level you're going to be scrutinizing according to the impact, the communities affected, and then the end users. What's interesting to take into account is that today there are 2 criteria that are obligatory: climate change and company turnover. And for the other criteria, the other 8 criteria, these will have to be dealt with. But to integrate them into your sustainability report, you will have to define them using this double materiality methodology. So whether they are, according to whether they're priority subjects or not. So this is an impact. There's an impact materiality. This is a great subject, this materiality subject. So there's the impact materiality. In other words, what are the impacts of my company on the environment given the criteria concerned, and what are, and on society as well, so there's the social aspect. And on the other hand, it's also important to analyze the financial matrix. And there the idea is to look at how global factors, exogenous factors, influence the performance of my company. So just to give you a very easy example, so let's take a ski resort and climate change. So the activity of ski resorts obviously has an impact and actually contributes to climate change because the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. But at the same time, from a financial performance point of view, well, climate change affects you because there are difficulties with snow coverage. So that's going to have a big impact on the economic performance of your company. And that's what's analyzed because it's the linchpin behind sustainability. The new thing now is that we're going to be adding ESG criteria in order to prevent risks. So that's the major new thing with respect to old regulations. So once you've done all of this work and you're really focusing on business strategy, and before you write the reports, you've got to look at governance processes in order to meet the ESG factors. What about the action plan? What about the KPIs? How do you manage risk and opportunity impacts? And how do you detect all of that within the double materiality matrix? So, of course, this leads to lots of different questions, this new regulation, which is an obligation. So, first of all, how do you take it on board in-house? That's the first question. So I'm going to turn to my guests now. They have different levels of maturity in this field. And we'll start with you, Marianne. So you are in charge of coordinating the CSRD. You're in charge of integrating it within your CSR strategy. You've also worked on your mission statement with 4 main themes that underlie the CSR strategy. So how are you realigning all of that? How are you taking all of that on board? Thank you. Hello, everybody. Perhaps just to specify, let me explain who Surfim is. Surfim, it's a family-based small company. Our profession focuses on planning, land planning, mountain land planning. We've got a stand. Come and see us. We're going to be present when it comes to energy networks, water networks, repairs on roads and bridges, recycling, pollution, renewable energy. I'm going through this quickly, the list. To come back to CSRD, I think we all have to keep in mind that we're not starting from scratch. The idea is that we all have something already when it comes to CSR. At Surfim, we already had a base. We are signatories of the UN Compact. So for 10 years, we've been interested in all of the sustainable development goals that cover all of the ESG criteria that you've just mentioned. We had a cross-cutting CSR commission because what you were explaining quickly with respect to CERFIB, why this cross-cutting approach? Well, we have 10 or so professions, 50 or so subsidiaries, and about 100 or so sites in France. And the question is, how do we consolidate? How do we, bring together all of these figures within the same report? So we've got the CSR cross-cutting commission, and we use that for feeding back information, whether it's information about the energy certificate or the CSRD, in less than a year and a half. So that's what we have to start with. And then, of course, we've got a CSR strategy, as you've mentioned. So we have we drew up a mission statement 2 years ago to contribute to better quality of life by planning and developing in line with living organisms. So we've got 5 priority pillars that cover everything that you can think about in relation to ESG. So social aspects, that's the first theme. Secondly, how do we reduce our own footprint? Third idea, how do we reduce the environmental footprint of the areas where we work? That's something that we find in the double materiality matrix, because the question of the impact of a company on its environment, it's not just a question of the negative impacts, it's also the positive impacts that the company might have. So it's important to keep that in mind. Fourth criterion or area, we thought about how we can regenerate living organisms or biodiversity. That's not easy in depollution, for example. That can help with biodiversity. Fifth concerns governance. So we already have that separation that helps us when it comes to setting up the CSRD. And we're already subject to an extra financial performance reporting. We've set up governance, therefore. I talked to you about the CSR Commission. I'm going to ask all CSR relays, to feedback indicators. So we have to look at our carbon footprint, obviously. That's one of the categories that's going to be obligatory according to the CSRD. And we're already asking for information from other fields. The difference with the CSRD is that we're going to have to use obligatory indicators. It's not me, as somebody in charge of CSR, or Alexandre Mathurin, who's the CEO, who's going to say, OK, in the water field, in the social field, we're going to focus on such and such a criterion. No, there will be an obligation. And as you were saying, this makes sense. The idea is to compare and to be able to say, OK, we've got the same indicators, the same criteria, and we're going to know whereabouts we are. So that's just to answer that question. How are we going to go about things? And then a second point that's very important, it concerns the double materiality matrix. It's important to think about that just for a moment. Very often, when you hear about the CSRD, there are lots of people who will say, well, it's very complex, it's awful, there are over 10,000 indicators, we're just not going to be able to do it. Yes, it is complex, most certainly it is. And that complexity, once again, is understandable. It's about being able to compare, being able to earmark investments for virtuous projects. And out of the 10,000 indicators, well, it's not true, in fact, because the double materiality indicator is going to allow you to analyze your activity, your business, and based on that analysis, you're then going to be able to say, OK, well, the most important fields, the ones with the biggest impact are water. And I think in mountain resorts, obviously water is very important. OK, so water becomes a material factor. And perhaps there are others that are much less material. So for these other fields that are not as strategic for you, you will not have to go through all of the indicators. So I just wanted to specify that. I'm not denying how complex the CSRD is, but it's important to be transparent when it comes to talking about these issues. Thank you very much for your testimonial. So if we were to take home 1 or 2 or 3 best practices, if you're starting to look into CSRD questions, what would you say? Well, I have to be modest. My neighbor has made much more headway than me. It took me several years to prepare. Well, let me advise you to pick up your own information. There are lots of conferences, lots of webinars, and share information with your partners, with the people around you, with everybody that is part of your value chain. And then once you've done that first phase, then it's up to you to decide how to move forward. But there are 2 important points. The first is the double materiality matrix. This is a complex exercise. I'm not going to steal your subject, steal your thunder. We're going to be helped with that exercise because we really want to start with the right kind of roadmap, and that's what's going to determine the next step. So we're going to have support to work with all of our professions and all of our value chains. So we're going to look at what is material, what is less material. The second point that we're going to pay attention to concerns the tools. How do you feedback all of these indicators? So how do you bring together 10 professions, 50 subsidiaries, 100 or so sites? I'm not going to have 10,000 indicators per profession, but I will have quite a lot. And if I multiply all of that, that's a lot of. That's a lot. Can you put all of that on one single Excel spreadsheet? No. So we're going to have a specific tool. And I think that's going to depend on your size, on your ambitions, on your challenges, but it is an obligatory step. And then, of course, you choose the right tool. Yes, and that takes us back to the complex aspects, and that's why I'm saying you need to pick up your own information. You will always be the best person for choosing your tool and the body that's going to provide you with support. You need to know where you're putting your foot. There's a third piece of advice, and now you're not necessarily the right audience. I usually talk to public authorities. This complexity, I think it's actually quite interesting. If we want to use the CSRD as a strategic driver for the company, and that's the case, it corresponds to a different way of analyzing your activities and anticipating risks. So perhaps in 10 years' time, we'll come back and we'll still be talking about it and we'll still be anticipating risks. But that complexity, you've got to dominate it, and that comes at a cost. So whatever the things that you're going to set up, you're going to need support and guidance. So I call on public authorities. I know there's not much public money around at the moment, but no, companies do need support. So the BPI, the ADEME, I talk to these kinds of things.
Now, Peggy, you're the general manager of the Belay site, which is a site of industrial excellence for cable winders. You are a pilot site now within the group. You coordinate the transition, environmental transition. There's 1,600 employees on board in the transition. You've really started this work to integrate CSRD in your company. Can you tell us more about this integration work and which organization you have implemented internally to really get all of your employees on board and all of the sites on board in this transition? Thank you. Let me correct. I'm not the general manager of Conductix. I've been working for 30 years. We manufacture energy management systems and data management systems to transfer data to mobile devices. I work also on a site that manufactures cable winding devices, and I'm in charge now of the environmental transition for Conductix in the world. There are 13 industrial sites, about 30 commercial entities, and 1,700 employees. How did we approach this? First of all, we report on the PEFs, but we didn't have any clear vision of all of the local initiatives, so we did an overview to get a good idea of what was happening. We tried to get an idea of the best practices that we could exchange. Initiatives were usually launched for legal reasons or because there was a good return on investment, and there were a few initiatives that were launched but that remained fairly minimal. So when we took stock of what existed, we saw that there was a different level of comprehension of climate challenges depending on the country. We worked on a climate fresco in 17 countries, and employees were volunteers. They registered for this fabulous adventure. It was very enriching, very interesting, because the climate fresco in the US is not at all the same one in China or in France. This allowed us to align everyone in terms of the climate challenges and the need to change, and it really launched a grassroots movement. And with all of our employees, we started initiating a strategy, designing a strategy based on 4 pillars: energy efficiency of buildings and processes, transport, minimizing goods and human being transport, and we worked on resources to minimize our resource consumption, and circularity, adopting the principles of the circular economy. And we also implemented a whole range of actions proposed by our employees. But beyond this, we had one global category because we had to measure the situation. We had a very partial idea of our impact because up until 2023, we were only reporting on Scope 1 and Scope 2, our direct impact, environmental impact, our direct carbon impact. So when we started working on Scope 3, I will tell you a bit more about it, we realized that we were reporting on 1% of our greenhouse gas emissions, so we weren't doing much. This didn't prevent us from putting in place new actions to insulate buildings, add PV panels, and almost 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions were we reduced them in scope 1 and 2, but it still represented only 1% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So we really had to take stock of where we were to prioritize our actions and be sure that our strategy was appropriate. So we then carried out our carbon balance analysis. My recommendation is to start small, do pilot projects before you deploy. We started with a pilot test on the Belay site, and it worked really well. We deployed on the 4 largest sites. So we reported on scope 1, 2, and 3 on our largest sites, and we realized that the use of products represented 75% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So there will be actions to carry out. And always with the local teams, very strong local commitment. You need a local pilot. If it comes from the top down and you try to hope that there will be a really general movement, it won't work. You have to explain things locally, and it works. And people commit. Then this publication of the CSRD arrived in July 2022, and the standards in November 2023. Sorry, July 2023 and November 2023. And then we had to analyze our double materiality. Either we look at that as another report, another constraint, or as an opportunity. At Conductix, we decided to just think of it as an opportunity. I worked a lot with a student from Grenoble here, from the INP engineering school. We mapped our flows, we did a lot of in-depth work, and then we defined working groups. These working groups, we set them up, and we asked them to reflect. We prepared this ahead of time. We tried to make the standard more easy to understand. We organized a webinar, we communicated a lot, and so we prepared the work, working on the impacts, the risks, and the opportunities with the different elements. And then we worked with the teams to have them validate the impacts, the risks, and the opportunities. And it became more concrete for them. It really spoke to them. There were explanations that they found really comprehensible. And after that, we set up a scoring with scales, and now we're working on self-evaluation. And the teams are really taking over the questions themselves. They identified the customers that we wanted to interview, and we identified the suppliers that we wanted to interview. And this is taking place, and it's going really well. Can you tell us the support functions? This pilot team represents whom? Well, we have all the members of the general management in the governance group. Then we have a group working for the suppliers, another group working for our own operations, environment, our own operations, social, governance, and customers. And they're representatives of all the sites. The major sites have a representative in these groups, and each group is piloted by a member of the general management. So concretely, everyone's involved, and the management is strongly involved in this process too. And in terms of consolidation, once you've collected all this data with the pilot team, we set up a matrix with a system of scoring that's quite precise to avoid a lot of arguments at the end saying, oh, it should be to the left, it should be to the right, or it should be 50, it should be 40. Because if people say, the less I put in, the less I report. And people, when the scoring's well done, at the end, you've placed it right here because that's where you should be. So then we accumulate the scores, and then there's a discussion, and a discussion about the costs. Because the whole challenge is to know what is important and what it can cost for you. What are the financial stakes for you, your suppliers, or your customers that may endanger your business? That's a real strategic tool if you pilot it properly. So there will be choices in terms of costs, what figures did we take into consolidation. But the idea is that it involves the survival of the company, and scoring and a financial evaluation should be very global. Thank you for this presentation. Now we'll hear from Julie. Julie Dalbon-Canassi, you worked in industry. You were a project manager at Eaton in QHSE. You manipulated a lot of ISO standards, 14,001 and 45,001. What link do you make between the CSRD and these ISO standards? Can this facilitate things for the CSRD? Well, indeed, the answer is yes. It can be an asset to put in place the management systems before, during. It doesn't matter the moment when you do so. Obviously, if it's before, you will have your management system that, whether you start with quality, the environment, or safety, this will give you a structure, a management structure for your entire company and departments that will really facilitate your approach, especially when you're questioning governance. If you make the link with CSRD, for the questions of dialogue with stakeholders, where you have a lot of structuring that can be given to you by ISO for these themes, and also those questions of risks and opportunities. When we really have the foundations, when you're setting up your management system, that have been based on that from your corporate strategy. And then the management systems, what they also can contribute is the organization of your company in terms of processes. Here you really have something that will allow you to make more durable and make more robust everything that the CSRD is asking you to do and obliging you to do in terms of obligations and consolidations. So these management systems will give you the methodology for the implementation, and it will make more systematic everything that the CSRD will ask you in terms of periodic or frequent updates, which are usually annual updates. And another thing that I could add is that the innovation in terms of ISO, this will concern ISO 9001, quality, the environment, and safety. For 2024 and 2025, there's an amendment which is planned, which is coming out for some, and which will come out for other ISOs in 2025 on the questions of climate risk challenges. So all of these questions are arriving everywhere at every level. So here you'll also have these questions of the climate risk challenges for your company and for your stakeholders. So it closes the loop with this double materiality loop and the double materiality matrix. And so it's great if you've already worked on ISO previously. You were talking about climate change. I thought it was important to invite Olivier Danet, who's the project manager at NG Solutions. At NG Solutions, you're developing projects. You work on projects in resorts with innovative solutions to respond to the challenges of decarbonization. You optimize every energy source with different solutions. I wanted you to tell us more about the challenges of decarbonization. Now, first, let me this is an aside, but in the framework of CSRD, climate change is part of the transition plan, which is mandatory. There's climate change and the headcount of the company. So it's quite complete what we're being asked concerning climate change and transition and decarbonization plans. Could you focus on the challenges of decarbonization? Yes, well, thank you, first of all, for your invitation, and hello to everyone. Now, the challenges of decarbonization, before we talk about that, before we talk about the national, regional, and level and the mountains, because here we're talking mainly about the mountains at this trade show, the challenges are enormous. As you said, The climate challenges are at a planetary level. These are challenges that go way beyond the local level. There are signatory states with what we call the COP, COP, the Conference of Parties. They work every year to bring out new roadmaps for improvement. And it's in this context that the European Union defined an objective that France has accepted, an objective to reduce greenhouse gases, which is enormous, to reduce them by 55% by 2030. 2030 is right around the corner. The reference is 90 versus the consumption, but 55% is half of our consumption. So the link with the CSRD is that, in fact, we're talking about durability and sustainability. If you haven't reached these objectives, the entity who hasn't reached these objectives will not have a viable model over time. Companies that don't integrate these challenges will not have a viable model. And we've seen this recently with the conflict in Ukraine and the increase in energy prices. Some companies had to stop producing because the costs of energy were just impossible. They were producing at a higher price than what they were selling. So in these models, this has to be integrated. So 55% is feasible. Peggy would say, she's always very positive, she would say that a constraint can be transformed into an opportunity. All of the activities sectors are concerned. You see at the national level, 1/3 of greenhouse gases come from transport. We're not surprised to see that. We've known it for many years now. This needs to be dealt with and anticipated. And at the regional level, it's very similar. It's about 1/3. But what really is different is that there are 3 other activity sectors that are also challenged: industry, agriculture, and the building sector, residential and tertiary office buildings, etc. It's about 18 to 20%. In Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, it's a bit more, because we are the leading industrial region, so we do emit greenhouse gases, and there are 5 large cities in the region. So in terms of buildings, there's a lot of work to be done. Now, to conclude by making a link with the mountains, there was a study that was carried out on CO2 emissions in the resorts. For your information, a skier emits 50 kilos per day for skiing day of CO2. Emissions are 60% linked to transport. To go up to the resorts, whether you come from abroad or France or the bottom of the valley, you have to go up to the resort and you emit greenhouse gases, and 30% is the construction of buildings and the use and operation of buildings in the resorts. The rest, the snowmakers, the groomers, the ski lifts, it represents 10%. They use electricity, often green electricity, and they emit very few greenhouse gases. Can you tell us about projects that you're developing in resorts, in ski resorts, for example, with buildings? Yes. In the mountains, as we've just seen, there are the buildings, and then there's the transport. Now, for buildings at ENGIE, we are energy providers, so we are more interested in the energy aspects. There are companies in the construction sector working on carbon emissions during construction and renovation, whereas we focus more on the energy consumption aspects. There are 2 elements in energy consumption. When you use fossil fuels, you have to reduce your consumption, so that's what we call frugality or sobriety. And then the second aspect is to produce renewable, decarbonized energy. So we're working on both. On the right, you have an example of a hotel residence, the group MMV, who are part of the Compagnie des Alpes, CDA, today. They have a very advanced policy that they're promoting to respond to several challenges. The first is that As a tertiary building, they have a certain number of constraints. They are covered by what they call in France the tertiary decree. Everything that's above 1,000 square meters is under an obligation by 2030 to reduce by 40% their energy consumption. And there's a second obligation, which is to reduce by 50% by 2040. So that is significant, but it corresponds to our greenhouse gas reduction challenge. So you can't just put a reduction on your shower head to reach these objectives. So we have to work more in depth. And the second point that concerns these tourism residences is they need to respond to their customers. Increasingly, people are becoming more eco-responsible. We are stakeholders in these transitions, and so customers prefer to go to hotel and tourism complexes that respect this. So these people have to work with their customers' expectations. And if you're obliged to do this, but the economic equation is not present, people won't do it. So rapidly, in terms of solutions, we work on the building envelope, we work on insulation, both the facades and in the rooftops, in the attics. We have energy recovery systems with water and wasted heat recovery. We have intelligent ventilation systems, recovering with airflows, and we also produce differently in terms of renewable energies. And for this building, we're working on a financial package to respond to the economic issues. There's a solution that exists where you can, what we call, densify this type of building. So this is a strategy, a model that we have to integrate for the sustainability of tourism activities. We have to say seasonal workers need to be housed. We need to finance these projects, and so raising the buildings can be another solution. Can you tell us about a project with flexibility that you've implemented with solutions of waste heat recovery, where you went to find several solutions to have something very decarbonized? Well, we worked. This is an example of energy sobriety, but for energy production, there is a resort in the Tarentaise Valley that has a project to develop an area at the entrance to the resort with hotels and lodging for seasonal workers and rental accommodations. And they, with the developer, the SAS, they worked on looking how they could have a better energy mix with decarbonized energy to respond to the problem of decarbonization and also make savings. So we worked together on a solution for the buildings so that the buildings would be in what we call a concerted development zone. Everyone can produce energy, but with certain specifications, and working on a district heating network with a solution that we proposed to recover the heat on wastewater in the existing buildings, and that is waste heat, and you produce it when you need it. Because the problem with some renewable energies is that they are generated in daytime when you don't need it, when people are skiing, or when there's wind and you don't necessarily need the energy. This is every time I use water, I need heat, and the waste heat is recovered, and then it's combined with geothermal projects, and then electrical water heater solutions, zero carbon, there's no combustion, and it's pretty virtuous. So this shows that we can do energy renovation even for new construction projects, and this is possible by mixing energy sources and working with players who can accomplish all of this for you? I see that time is running out. This CSRD that requires a large transformation in companies and a colossal awareness raising and mobilization of the teams and resources, how could you define what CSRD can contribute to the performance of the company? How do you see that? Well, we've all discussed this a little bit, but it's a fabulous analysis tool for your business model and your activities. It really forces you to sit down and ask yourself, what are the impacts that we have as a company, but what are the risks and the opportunities that we need to take into account that will be coming in the next 5 to 10 years? We talked a lot about mountain areas, but I think here they know what we're talking about when you talk about risks and opportunities. When you're spending your holidays in the mountains, for companies, it's the same thing. There are probably certain professions that we're going to have to reorient and things that we'll have to do differently. There are a lot of opportunities for us. As I said, we're working with water, energy, and the circular economy. And so this CSRD allows us to have a very fine-tuned methodology that's quite powerful. We were talking about this when we prepared this roundtable. It's complex, but it's a methodology that's a step-by-step methodology. It's sort of like paying for a super strategic consultant. For me, it's a very powerful strategic lever that can help you really propel your company into the future. So it's a management system, an integrated management system for the company. Peggy, do you have a few words about the opportunity to maintain companies' performances? Well, I wanted to react to what you said in the beginning. The fact that you combine ESG topics with financial topics, that's the real bridge that we needed. And it's imposed by CSRD now. And when we start to see the cost of every risk and opportunity, we're going to say we really have to move faster. Our business is really at risk. If we only look at ourselves and we don't look at your entire value chain, we will probably neglect a lot of things. So indeed, it is very constraining, very complicated, but the methodology allows us not to forget a single element and make sure that we will still be here tomorrow. And we do see that in the optimization solutions, there are many things that allow us to make savings at scale. You're working on electrification, so of course, I agree. I wanted to add something when I was listening to you. This standard, this obligation for transparency and being very demanding with the energy transition, let me draw a parallel with the digital transformation. If it had existed when we switched from traditional photos to digital photos, the whole problem that Kodak had would not have happened. Kodak refused in its strategic vision and its business model, they refused to anticipate the future. Whereas with the CSRD, you're forced to do so. And I think it's really for the common good, and it's for the durability of our companies. And there's this term durability in terms, and then sustainability in terms of the planetary limits, but also the durability and the performance of the company, thanks to the risk analysis. So the term durability is very strong. Julie, you wanted to add something? Yes, I just wanted to add, given the 3 testimonials about putting this into practice, and what's just been highlighted again, is that you really need to keep in mind the CSRD approach as a steering tool, a strategic steering tool. Don't look at it as a constraint, just another regulatory constraint, that it's just a report that you have to do, just an additional report with a lot of figures. Really consider it as a real opportunity for your company, for your entire value chain. It's a real strategic opportunity to make progress with these challenges. And as you said, Peggy, it touches upon all of the aspects, the financial aspects. There's a link with your business, with the core of your business. So really keep this in mind and take it and think of it as a strategic tool that's really an important one. And it really concerns the future of your company. Well, thank you. Thank you all for listening to this roundtable. Now, for those of you who would like to join us, if you have questions on CSRD, there's the VIP space just next door. We'd be happy to meet you there and have additional discussions. I also have a QR code here on the screen, a link for questions and answers. You can send us an email if you want to have more information. I invite you to click on the QR code, and we expect you to join us just next door at the VIP space to continue these discussions. Thank you very much.